When I woke up, Claire was standing beside my hospital bed with an organ acceptance form crumpled in her hand. It was already void. She did not ask whether I was in pain. She did not tell me how long I had been unconscious. She only said, "The liver has already been transplanted into Adrian." I stared at her while the sluggish beep of the monitor swallowed every other sound in the room. Only a few hours earlier, that liver had been meant for me. My blood type matched. My body size matched. My disease score and the transport distance matched. The transplant coordinator had listed me as the primary recipient. Then hepatic encephalopathy had briefly left me incapable of making decisions. And Claire, my wife and medical proxy, had declined the organ on my behalf. The backup recipient happened to be her ex-boyfriend, Adrian. Claire lowered her voice. He wouldn't have survived long enough for another chance. My throat tasted like blood. "What about me?" I asked. She paused for several seconds. "You were more stable." I looked at the creases in the sleeve of her white surgical coat and understood something with sudden, brutal clarity. She was not explaining herself to her husband. She was delivering a postoperative summary of her own clinical judgment. "Did I ever explicitly refuse this category of donor?" I asked. For the first time, her gaze slipped away from mine. "You weren't lucid, so you decided for me. I'm your wife. I also understand your condition better than anyone." Footsteps sounded outside the room. Naomi, the transplant coordinator, came in. The relief on her face when she saw me awake was unmistakable. She opened her mouth, but Claire cut her off. "Ethan needs to rest." Naomi did not leave. Instead, she placed a form on the table beside my bed and spoke with deliberate care. "Ethan, you have the right to know that after the organ arrived at our center, we completed the preliminary assessment. The pathology findings were within an acceptable range. Your proxy signed a refusal on the grounds that you had previously opposed expanded criteria donors." I looked at Claire. 6 months earlier, while fully competent, I had signed an informed consent form agreeing to receive expanded criteria organs. The document was still in my patient portal. Claire could not possibly have been unaware of it. She was one of the youngest attending hepatobiliary surgeons at Northlake Medical Center. She knew every step of the process. She knew that once the primary recipient declined, the organ would immediately be offered to the backup recipient already on standby. And she knew Adrian had been upstairs in the preoperative unit that night. "Naomi," I said, "preserve every proxy decision made today, every phone record, and every signed document in my medical chart." Claire's expression hardened. "You just woke up. Don't turn this into an investigation." "This is an investigation." I pulled the pulse oximeter clip from my finger, then collapsed back against the pillow when the room tilted. "Effective immediately. You are no longer my medical proxy." Claire flinched as if I had struck her. Her voice tightened. "Ethan, you're angry. You're not thinking clearly." "No." I held her gaze. "I'm making sure that the next time someone asks whether I want to live, you won't be the one answering." Naomi did not take sides. She called in a nurse, confirmed that I was oriented and competent, and handed me the paperwork to appoint a new proxy. I named my sister, Grace. My hand shook badly as I signed. When Claire saw Grace's name on the line, genuine panic crossed her face for the first time. "You'll regret dragging a family matter into the hospital," she said. "You already dragged an old love into the operating room." I did not argue with her again that night. The first thing I did was ask Grace to remove my phone, laptop, and the locked file box from our house. I made my living investigating insurance claims. My job was never to catch one lie. It was to put every timestamp, every access event, and every original document onto the same line until the truth had nowhere left to hide. When something is serious enough, anger can tell you that you have been wounded. Only evidence can tell everyone else who caused the wound. Grace came to the hospital the next day. She did not ask why Claire had done it. She asked, "Do you want to stay alive? Or do you want to prove she was wrong first?" "Stay alive. Then we transfer you." Northlake's transplant team included Claire's colleagues, mentors, and longtime collaborators. They might not protect her, but as long as my medical care and the investigation remained under the same roof, every clinical judgment would be shadowed by suspicion. Grace contacted Eastbridge Transplant Institute, an independent center on the other side of Greyhaven. They agreed to evaluate me, but transferring my candidacy required a fresh review of my scans, infection markers, support plan, and insurance authorization. While we waited, my liver function continued to deteriorate. Every morning. The first thing I did was confirm that I could still state the date, my location, and Grace's name. Claire visited every day. She brought the unsweetened ginger tea I liked. She adjusted my pillow to the height I had always preferred. After the nurses left, she would sit at the foot of my bed as if familiarity itself could pull us back into place. She did not understand that death was no longer the thing I feared most. What terrified me was knowing that I had once placed the authority to decide how I died in her hands. On the third day, she finally said, "Adrian's surgery went well." I said nothing. She kept explaining. His portal vein was in terrible condition. If he had missed this opportunity, he probably wouldn't have made it out of the hospital. When did you learn he was the backup recipient? Claire went silent. That's protected information. You weren't his treating physician. I saw the list during a case conference. Because I was a candidate. You should have recused yourself from that conference. Her jaw tightened. I didn't vote. But you remembered the order. Ethan, I had minutes to decide. Minutes were enough for you to save him and abandon me. She stood, anger pressed flat beneath her voice. You make it sound as though I walked over and pulled out your breathing tube. I looked at her. You declined a liver that had already been matched to me. The only difference is that you didn't have to see blood. After Claire left, Grace took my donor consent form from her file bag. Its language was unambiguous. As long as biopsy and intraoperative assessment met the center's standards, I would accept organs from older donors, donors with mild fatty change, and donors carrying certain treatable infection risks. The liver Adrian received fell within one of those categories. Claire had told the coordinator that I had always rejected that level of risk. She had not misunderstood my wishes. She had overruled them. I submitted a written preservation request to the hospital's patient rights office. I demanded that they retain the organ offer log, the coordinator's recorded calls, the proxy refusal form, the electronic chart access audit, and the on-call committee records. It was not a lawsuit. Not yet. It was a litigation hold notice. The hospital's legal department sent a representative almost immediately. His name was Marcus. He wore a dark suit without a single visible crease. He told me Northlake would begin an internal quality review, but because the allocation involved another patient's privacy, much of the information could not be released directly to me. I only want the portions that concern me, I said. Who declined the organ for me? What basis she claimed? Who verified my prior wishes? And how the center documented the refusal afterward? Marcus studied me for a long moment. You know exactly what you're asking for. It's an occupational habit. It may also make your marriage impossible to repair. That is not a risk the hospital is responsible for assessing. He stopped trying to persuade me. Before he left, he warned that a quality review could take weeks. Reality did not speed up because I was dying. The hospital had its procedures. The medical board had its procedures. The transfer process had its procedures. My body did not. Before dawn on the 5th day, an esophageal varix ruptured. Blood poured from my mouth while Grace was reading me an insurance authorization email. She hit the call button. Nurses and residents rushed in, and I was taken for emergency endoscopic treatment. When I woke, the first thing I asked was, "Did the notices go out?" Grace's eyes were red. "You almost died. That's why I'm asking." She turned her phone toward me. Mara Quinn, an attorney I knew from complex liability cases, had formally sent preservation notices to the hospital, the organ allocation office, and Claire's personal counsel. Mara did not promise me a victory. She told me that any case involving medical proxy authority and an organ refusal would turn on three things. First, whether I had lacked the capacity to decide for myself. Second, whether Claire's decision had contradicted my known and verifiable wishes. Third, whether her motive had been compromised by an undisclosed conflict of interest. The medical record and my written consent already established the first two. The third would be the hardest. The fact that Claire had once loved Adrian did not, by itself, make her conduct unlawful. The fact that she knew he was the backup recipient did not, by itself, prove that she had deliberately sacrificed me. We needed evidence that when she acted as my proxy, she placed Adrian's interests ahead of mine. Mara warned me not to bait Claire into making statements, and not to secretly record calls in violation of the law. She told me to preserve only our ordinary communications. That was exactly what I did. I deleted none of Claire's messages. At first, she said she had simply made an impossible choice. Then she said that if I continued with the complaint, Adrian's private medical information would be dragged into the investigation. Later, She reminded me that her income paid most of our mortgage and carried our health insurance. I stared at that message for a long time. We had bought our house after we were married. Part of the down payment had come from selling the small woodworking shop my grandfather left me. Claire earned more, but for years, whenever she worked overnight, attended training, or flew out of town for surgery, I rearranged my work so our home would keep functioning. A marriage is not a profit and loss statement with only one salary column. But the moment she began reminding me who earned more, I knew she was preparing for what came next. I asked Mara to recommend a family law attorney. His name was Julian. The first thing he asked was whether I truly wanted a divorce. I haven't decided how this ends, I said, but I need her removed from every position that allows her to make decisions for me. Julian helped me change my medical proxy, financial power of attorney, emergency contact, and life insurance beneficiary. He did not advise me to hide or transfer marital property. That would have been illegal, and it would have turned against me in court. We only stopped non-essential automatic transfers from accounts in my name, and required both signatures for any joint account expense above the ordinary household threshold. I also moved the remaining separate property from my grandfather's workshop into a regulated trust account. Every step had a documented legal basis. Every step involved only property I had the right to control. Claire discovered that the automatic transfers had stopped just as Adrian was preparing to leave the hospital and begin rehabilitation. She called me and demanded to know why I had cancelled the monthly deposit into a private care account. That was the first time I learned the account existed. For the previous 6 months, she had been moving money from our joint account in small increments, labeling the transfers Postoperative Research Fund and Family Emergency Reserve. No single amount was large enough to trigger a bank alert. Together, however, they were enough to cover several months of Adrian's immunosuppressant copays and short-term care. You used our marital funds to prepare for his recovery? I asked. That money wasn't only for him, Claire said at once. Who is the beneficiary? She did not answer. Julian requested the complete bank records. 2 days later, we received them. The account was jointly administered by Claire and Adrian's sister. Adrian's name never appeared in the notes, but the payees included a post-transplant care agency and a short-term apartment complex near Northlake. Claire had not acted on impulse. She had been preparing for Adrian's life after transplant long before the organ offer arrived. That did not directly prove what motivated her refusal on my behalf, but it proved that her interests had remained entangled with Adrian's, and that she had concealed that fact from me. Claire came to Eastbridge that evening. The moment she stepped into my room, she said, "The money will be paid back." When did this start? After Adrian was relisted as a candidate. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have misunderstood. You took money from our joint account to prepare your ex-boyfriend for life after surgery. And you think the problem is that I would have misunderstood? She closed her eyes as though forcing herself to stay calm. He didn't have family who could afford it. His sister is raising 2 children, without stable housing and a care plan. The transplant committee might have removed him from the list. Then I understood. A transplant candidate needed more than medical eligibility. He also had to prove that after surgery, he could take medication on schedule, attend follow-up appointments, and rely on a basic support network. Claire's money and housing arrangement had helped Adrian remain eligible. She had not made a single decision on one terrible night. She had quietly become his support system, and I was the man she assumed would never leave. You want me to understand that you were saving someone? I said. Yes. Did it ever occur to you that I was a patient too? Her lips parted, but no words came. You gave him money, I continued. You gave him housing. You helped him preserve his transplant status. And in the end, you declined my organ for him. You didn't choose between 2 people in a single emergency. You moved me out of your priorities one step at a time. Claire's eyes finally filled with tears. Ethan, he saved my life. It was the first time she told me the whole story. During her final year of medical school, the apartment building where she lived caught fire. Adrian ran into the smoke and dragged her out through a rear stairwell. He suffered lung damage and spent a long time in the hospital. Later, Claire entered surgical training and became consumed by work. Adrian's liver disease was diagnosed a few years after that. They broke up under the weight of stress and resentment. Claire had always believed she had chosen her career at the moment he needed her most. I owed him a life, she said. So you repaid him with mine? Her head snapped up. That isn't what I meant. But it is what you did, she cried then. Not wildly. The tears simply fell. one after another, onto the backs of her hands. Once, the sight of her crying would have ended every question. I would have held her and polished her reasons until they sounded kinder than the truth. This time, I pressed the call button and asked a nurse to escort her out. At the door, she turned back. "You've become a stranger." "No," I said. "I've finally stopped explaining you to yourself." My transfer review was completed on the 9th day. Eastbridge placed me in the high priority tier, but Northlake's refusal still appeared in the national organ offer system. Any center reviewing me could see that my proxy had previously declined a liver with a similar risk profile. That could make a transplant team question whether my true preferences were unstable. Naomi voluntarily submitted a corrective note. She documented my prior written consent, my impaired mental status at the time of the refusal, and the replacement of my proxy. She did not speculate about Claire's motives. She simply completed the factual record. That note preserved my eligibility for the same class of donor. I sent Naomi a thank you email. Her reply was brief. I only made the chart look the way it should have looked from the beginning. I remembered that sentence. Reliable people do not substitute relationships for procedure. They make sure procedure preserves the facts. Northlake temporarily removed Claire from transplant duty 2 weeks after Adrian's surgery. It was not a final disciplinary action. The hospital had only concluded that while the conflict of interest investigation remained open, she should not have access to candidate lists or organ offer information. She could continue ordinary hepatobiliary surgery, but she was excluded from the transplant decision chain. She messaged me that I had destroyed years of her work. I did not respond. An hour later, another message appeared. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." She was beginning to understand that my complaint was not a punishment I had invented for her. Her own conduct had triggered consequences that already existed. Meanwhile, Adrian recovered quickly. Claire had apparently believed that if he survived, every sacrifice would become meaningful. Instead, the first thing he did after discharge was move out of the apartment she had arranged. He returned the unused care funds and had his lawyer notify Claire that he and his insurance would handle all future medical expenses. When Claire told me, there was hurt in her voice. "Why did he leave?" I asked. "He said he didn't know the liver had originally been assigned to you." "You didn't tell him?" Claire did not answer. I understood. She had told Adrian there might be an opportunity, but not that the opportunity existed because she had declined the organ on her husband's behalf. She had tried to preserve 2 versions of herself. To me, she was a wife who had made an agonizing medical judgment. To Adrian, she was the woman who had finally repaid an old debt and saved his life. Neither version could survive the complete truth. During the 3rd week, my ascites worsened and my kidney function began to fluctuate. Victor, my physician at Eastbridge, told me that if the wait continued, my surgical risk would rise sharply. He did not comfort me with promises that another liver would arrive soon. He only said that everyone on the list was racing the clock. That day, I asked Mara and Julian to come to my room. I signed a new will. It was not designed to strip Claire of everything in some theatrical act of revenge. Julian explained that as long as we remained married, she might still have a statutory right to a spousal share. I did not try to evade the law. The will disposed only of assets I was legally entitled to direct. I left the separate property from my grandfather's workshop, my rights to any insurance recovery, and my personal riding royalties to Grace and to a newly created patient autonomy fund. Marital property would still be handled under the law. I removed Claire as executor. I named Grace as custodian of my medical records. The most important provision was an evidence release clause. If I died from liver failure, infection, bleeding, or transplant delay, my executor was required to preserve and seek lawful disclosure of every record connected to the declined organ offer. That included the coordinator's recording, electronic access logs, the proxy refusal form, committee minutes, and every communication we had legally obtained. I also recorded the entire signing. On camera, I accurately stated my name, the scope of my property, my family relationships, and the meaning of every provision. Mara asked why I was doing it. "Because I can't guarantee I'll live long enough to see the investigation finish," I said. "But I can guarantee that my death won't erase the question." A letter to Claire was attached to the end of the will. I did not let the attorneys read it. It was the only thing I wrote that was not intended for a courtroom. After I signed, exhaustion took me under for an entire day. When I woke, Grace was sitting by the window, peeling an apple. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Yes." "Of dying?" of reaching the end and remembering my marriage as nothing but a refusal form. Grace set the apple down. Then remember what came before. Remember how you carried her through residency. Remember how she stood beside you when you buried Grandpa. Remember the two of you painting the walls of that house together. Those things were real too. What she did later doesn't make everything before it falls. But the fact that the past was real doesn't make what happened later forgivable. I closed my eyes. For the first time since I became ill, I allowed myself to admit that I still loved Claire. The love had not died. Trust had died first. Early one morning in the 4th week, Eastbridge received another organ offer. The donor matched my blood type. The transport window was manageable. The biopsy findings were good. This time, the coordinator read every risk directly to me. Grace sat beside me. Victor asked whether I accepted. Yes, I said. No one answered for me. Claire arrived before surgery. Security stopped her outside the preoperative area because I had revoked her visitation authorization. She called Grace and begged for one final meeting. Grace asked me. I shook my head. Claire sent a voice message instead. Ethan, I know you won't believe me, but I never wanted you to die. I listened, then handed the phone back to Grace. Save it. You want to use it against her? No. Then why? Because it's part of the truth. She didn't want me dead. She was simply willing to make me bear a risk of death that she considered acceptable. Before they wheeled me into the operating room, Victor confirmed my identity, the procedure, and the donor number once more. The ceiling lights passed above me, one after another. I remembered our wedding day, when Claire had held my hand and promised that whatever happened, she would stand on my side. Back then, we both believed betrayal had to come with malice. I learned later that the most dangerous betrayal often disguises itself as benevolence. It says it sees farther than you do. It says it has made the harder choice. It may even believe that one day, the person it harmed will understand. The surgery lasted for hours. When I woke, my abdomen felt as though a burning iron cable had been cinched around it. Grace was asleep with her head on the edge of my bed. Victor told me the new liver had already begun functioning. I did not feel reborn. I only felt tired. Recovery is never a single moment. It is a few more steps each day. One more bite of food. One less fever. One fewer abnormal result. Claire did not return to the hospital. From then on, she contacted me through counsel. Northlake's internal investigation required her to submit a written statement. In her first version, she admitted that she had declined the liver as my spouse, but insisted the decision reflected preferences I had expressed in the past. The hospital pulled the audit log from my electronic chart. It showed that after I lost capacity, Claire had used her physician credentials to open my historical donor consent documents. In other words, before she signed the refusal, she had reviewed my written agreement to accept expanded criteria organs. Worse, the day after the refusal, she added a retrospective note to my chart stating that I had previously expressed verbal opposition to high-risk donors. Late entries are not inherently improper. Physicians add clarifying information all the time. The problem was that Claire was not my treating doctor. Her note identified no source, no specific date, no location, and no witnesses. The audit system preserved both the creation time and the account used. She could not make the entry look as though it had always been there. The coordinator's call had also been recorded as part of Northlake's routine quality control process for organ offers. On the recording, Naomi reminded Claire that my written consent remained valid. Claire replied, I know, but I'm his proxy. And I don't believe Ethan would accept this organ. Naomi asked, Did he explicitly tell you that? Or is that your judgment? There was a pause. Then Claire said, It is my judgment. That sentence destroyed every explanation she offered afterward. A proxy may decide when a patient lacks capacity, but the proxy's first duty is to follow the patient's known wishes as closely as possible. Only when those wishes are unclear may the proxy substitute a best interest judgment. My wishes had not been unclear. Claire had simply believed that her judgment mattered more. Adrian's messages did not appear by magic. After the hospital review, Mara filed a narrowly tailored civil action alleging that Claire had breached her duties as my proxy and caused damages through transplant delay. The court permitted limited discovery related to motive. Adrian was not a defendant, but he received a third-party subpoena. His attorney raised privacy objections. The judge restricted production to communications concerning the organ offer, Claire's proxy decision, and her financial support. All unrelated medical details were redacted. Only a handful of texts were produced. They were enough. After the liver offer came in, Claire had messaged Adrian. There may be an opportunity tonight. Keep your phone on. Adrian replied. Isn't Ethan ahead of me? Claire wrote. He can't make the decision right now. I'll handle it. Adrian asked. Has he agreed? Claire did not answer directly. She only wrote. You cannot wait any longer. Adrian had not masterminded what happened, but he knew I was first in line, and he knew Claire intended to handle the matter in her role as my proxy. He chose not to ask anything else. A dying person will seize any chance to live. I understood that instinct. Understanding it did not erase his responsibility. He had at least one opportunity to ask what Claire meant by handling it. He did not. Adrian later submitted a sworn declaration. He admitted that he had suspected the liver was originally intended for me. He also admitted that Claire had previously provided the housing and care funds necessary to support his candidacy. He said he had not known I had signed written consent for that donor category, and he had not known Claire would later add a note to my chart. His declaration did not cost him the transplanted organ. Once an organ has been lawfully implanted, it is not taken back because a later dispute arises over allocation. Nor did receiving the surgery automatically make him a criminal. But his statement made it impossible for Claire to claim there had been no continuing conflict of interest between them. Northlake completed its investigation 2 months after my transplant. The hospital concluded that the allocation system itself had operated in the proper order. The failure occurred at the stage where the primary recipient's proxy declined the organ. Claire had not disclosed either her prior intimate relationship with the backup recipient or her ongoing financial support of him. She had substituted her personal judgment for my documented wishes despite knowing those wishes said the opposite. She had also used physician privileges to access information unrelated to her clinical duties and had added an unsupported retrospective note to my medical record. The hospital did not collapse. The transplant program did not shut down because of one person's conduct. Northlake suspended Claire's transplant privileges, removed her from the candidate selection committee, and referred the investigative record to the state medical licensing board. The hospital also changed its procedures. From then on, any known relationship between a medical proxy and a backup recipient required an immediate independent ethics consultation. And whenever a hospital physician acted as proxy for a family member, an outside on-call physician had to review the patient's prior directives. Those changes could not return the first liver to me, but they reduced the chance that another patient would be pushed out of a medical process by someone else's private loyalties. The day Claire received the disciplinary notice, she came to the house we still owned together. I was not yet strong enough to stand for long, so Grace came with me to collect my belongings. The house looked almost exactly as it had when I left. The ginger tea Claire bought for me still sat on the dining table. Our travel plans from the previous year were still pinned to the refrigerator. Claire stood in the middle of the living room like someone unsure whether she still had the right to call the place home. She looked at Grace first. I want to speak to him alone. No, I said. You don't need to. Her eyes dropped to the healing incision across my abdomen. How is your recovery? The doctors say I'm stable. Any rejection? Controlled so far. These were questions a wife should have known the answers to before anyone else. Now she could only ask them like an old contact whose access had been revoked. I've stopped paying any of Adrian's expenses, she said. I gave no response. I don't see him anymore either. That is your decision, Ethan. I'm losing everything. I looked at her. You are alive. You have an attorney, an income, equity in this house, and the right to defend yourself. When I lost that liver, I had no opportunity at all. The color drained from her face. Do you have to say everything in the cruelest possible way? I'm only separating what each of us lost. You lost a position, a reputation, and a marriage. I lost an organ that might have kept me alive, and my trust in my wife. Claire walked to the bookshelf and picked up our wedding photograph. Is there truly no way back? No. Because I saved Adrian? Because you used my choice to save him. If you had been awake that night, would you have watched him die? You still don't understand. I slowly straightened my back. My answer does not matter. What matters is that I was the one entitled to give it. Claire covered her mouth as tears began to fall. Every day I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't signed that form. Whether you would have received the transplant first. Whether Adrian would have died. There is no answer I can live with. So you came here hoping I would carry that answer for you. She shook her head. I only wanted you to know that I regret it. Regret does not return the choice to me. It only means you have finally begun to feel the consequences. Julian served her with the divorce petition soon afterward. I did not demand that she surrender her share of the house. The property would be sold at an appraised value. After the mortgage was paid, the remaining equity would be divided according to law. Her retirement accounts would be apportioned based on contributions accumulated during the marriage. My separate property would remain separate. The marital funds used for Adrian's care plan would be credited back against Claire's share of the property division. No one walked away penniless overnight. No single sentence stripped her of every asset she owned. Money was not what finally broke her. During divorce discovery, Claire's attorneys challenged whether I had possessed full legal capacity when I changed my will and beneficiaries. They suggested that hepatic encephalopathy and powerful medication had driven me to make retaliatory arrangements. Mara responded with a complete video of the signing, declarations from 2 witnesses, and an independent physician's competency assessment. The will entered the evidentiary record. That was the first time Claire read it. It did not deprive her of any statutory right. It explicitly stated that any spousal share would be governed by applicable law. But she was no longer my executor. She was no longer my medical proxy. She was no longer the beneficiary of my life insurance. I had assigned my separate assets, and any claim arising from the declined liver to the Patient Autonomy Fund. If I died, Grace was required to continue the investigation. If I lived, the fund would support independent patient advocates for transplant candidates who could not afford one. Claire reached the final pages and saw the letter. Her attorney asked whether she needed a break. She shook her head. There were no insults in the letter. I had written, "Claire, I once believed marriage meant that when I was at my most vulnerable, you would protect my wishes. Instead, you used my body as the place where you made a decision about which life mattered more. I do not deny that you saved Adrian. I do not deny that you may have sincerely believed I would receive another chance. But loving someone does not mean deciding which risk of death he should be forced to accept. If I do not survive long enough to receive another liver, do not describe my death as an error in judgment. It will be the consequence of knowing my choice and crossing over it anyway. What I leave you is not property. It is not forgiveness. It is the last complete truth of our marriage. I once placed my life in your hands. You placed it behind someone else's." Mara later told me that Claire stopped reading for a long time. She did not sob. She did not faint. She pressed the pages against her chest as though she had finally felt the weight of the refusal form inside my body. "When did he write this?" she asked. "Before the second organ offer," Mara said. "Did he think he was going to die? He knew he might not survive the wait." That was when Claire truly broke down. Not because the will reduced what she might inherit. Because she realized that at the moment I was closest to death, I had not been planning revenge. I had been planning to make sure the truth completed its path through the proper process. Even if I did not live to see it, she had believed my complaint, my transfer, the change of proxy, and the divorce preparations were all weapons intended to force her back toward me. The will proved that I had already begun preparing for a life without her. It also prepared for a truth that might have to continue without me. Claire later proposed the settlement. She agreed to admit that she had breached her duties as my proxy and to compensate my additional medical expenses, transfer costs, lost income, and therapy expenses. She would not admit that she had intentionally wanted to harm me. I had never accused her of that. Intentional cruelty was not the most frightening part of what happened. The most frightening part was that she genuinely believed she had the right to weigh my life for me. We ultimately reached a limited civil settlement. Part of the payment came from insurance, and part came from Claire personally. The agreement did not silence me. I remained free to speak about my own medical experience, and to quote public records or records that belonged to me. I could not disclose Adrian's redacted private medical details. I accepted that boundary. Exposure does not mean throwing everyone's privacy into the street. The strongest public account is the one that can stand inside the law. I appeared under my own name on an investigative podcast. I did not describe Adrian's specific medical condition. I said only that a physician spouse, acting under a conflict of interest, had declined an already matched organ for her incapacitated husband. I showed my written consent, the proxy refusal form, excerpts from the recorded call, and the audit findings. After the episode aired, Northlake released a statement describing its procedural reforms. The Medical Licensing Board confirmed that a formal case was underway. Claire did not lose her license overnight. She had the right to defend herself. The hearings continued for months. In the end, the board found serious violations of professional boundaries. failure to disclose a conflict of interest, and improper medical record practices. Her license was suspended for a period of time. After reinstatement, she was required to practice under supervision, complete ethics training, and submit to chart review. She could never return to the center of transplant surgery. Claire was still a surgeon with years of training behind her, but the professional identity she cherished most had been cut open by the record she created with her own hands. Adrian gave an interview as well, though not with me. He said he would spend the rest of his life confronting the complicated meaning of the organ he had received. He did not ask me to forgive him. He only admitted that when Claire said she would handle it, he chose silence. Listening to him did not make me feel triumphant. I did not forgive him either. Some responsibilities do not disappear when they are acknowledged. They simply acquire their proper name. Our divorce was finalized nearly a year after my transplant. The house was sold. I recovered the separate portion traceable to the sale of my grandfather's workshop, as well as my lawful share of the marital estate. Claire reimbursed the joint funds she had diverted into Adrian's care plan. She did not challenge the assets I had committed to the patient autonomy fund. On the day we signed the final papers, she looked much thinner than before. She placed her wedding ring on the table. "Do you still hate me?" she asked. "I thought about it. Sometimes. What about someday?" "Someday. Maybe I won't." A faint hope appeared in her eyes. I continued, "But not hating you will not mean coming back." The hope faded. She nodded. "I know." "Before leaving," she said, "I've read your letter many times. I used to believe the hardest thing was choosing between two people who were both dying. Later, I understood that I never had the right to choose for either of them." It was the first time she had named the wrong accurately. Accuracy had come too late. I did not hug her. I did not tell her I hoped she would be happy. I only said, "Remember that sentence the next time you stand beside a patient." She remained at the door for a long moment. "I will." In the second year of my recovery, I returned to work at Greyline Claims Group. I could no longer pull all-nighters the way I once had. I could not take painkillers casually or miss follow-up appointments. I took immunosuppressants on schedule, had blood drawn regularly, and avoided infection risks wherever I could. Survival was not an ending. It was long, expensive work that demanded discipline every day. I also began volunteering as an advisor for the Patient Autonomy Fund. The people who came to us were not only transplant candidates. They included patients in comas, elderly patients, people facing complex surgery, and anyone afraid that a family member might replace their wishes with a decision of their own. We helped them write their medical directives clearly, choose proxies they could truly trust, preserve copies, and tell their families where the documents were stored. Someone once asked whether everything that happened had destroyed my belief in marriage. "No," I said. "I still believe in it, but I no longer treated love as a substitute for procedure. Real love is willing to put your choices in writing, preserve them, and follow them when everything becomes chaotic. It does not step over you because it is more knowledgeable, more wounded, or more convinced that it has a better reason." Grace eventually placed my old will in a gray document box. I had already executed a new one. The evidence release clause remained. The letter to Claire remained too, though it was no longer the first document in the file. The fund expanded the range of people it could serve. I used part of the settlement to finance independent patient advocacy services. The rest became a reserve for my long-term medical care. There was no mansion. My money did not magically double. No new woman waited at the end of the story to heal me. What I gained was simpler. I recovered the right to make decisions about my own body, property, and life. During one follow-up visit at Eastbridge, I saw Naomi in the lobby. She had transferred there. "How have you been?" she asked. "My numbers are stable. The fund has started receiving referrals." She smiled. "That's good." I asked why she had been willing to add that corrective note to my chart. "Because a medical record isn't there to preserve a doctor's dignity," Naomi said. "It is there to preserve the patient's facts." We parted in the lobby. Outside, sunlight touched the scar across my abdomen. It was not a medal of victory. It reminded me that I had nearly died because of someone who was certain she was right. It also reminded me that institutions are imperfect. But when records are preserved, procedures are triggered, and evidence is respected, no individual's power remains limitless. Claire contacted me one final time. On the first day she returned to restricted practice. She did not ask to reconcile. She sent only 2 sentences. "Today I treated a patient who needed a family member to act as proxy. I read his written directive 3 times. I stared at the message for a long while and did not reply. A victim is not required to certify another person's growth. Doing the right thing was Claire's responsibility from then on. I put my phone away and entered the fund's conference room. A new advance directive form lay on the table. A young man sat across from me, visibly nervous. His wife held his hand. He was about to undergo high-risk surgery, and did not know whom he should appoint as proxy. I did not tell him whom to choose. I asked one question: when you can no longer speak, who will repeat the choice you made instead of inventing a new one for you? He fell silent. His wife slowly released his hand. Together, they began reading every line that defined the proxy's authority. In that moment, I understood what had truly shattered Claire when she read my will. It was not that the document pushed her outside my estate. It was that after she had surrendered my chance to live, I still used the last of my strength to preserve other people's right to choose. Claire had believed she was saving one person. She had nearly turned me into another person sacrificed without a voice. I refused to let what happened remain buried in the ruins of our marriage. I turned it into records, rules, and warnings. The liver that should have been offered to me first would never come back. I would never pretend the second chance erased the first injury. But no one would ever again decide on my behalf whose life I should surrender my own chance to save. At the fund's first public information session, the room filled with patients and relatives, someone asked whether signing a medical proxy document was enough. No, I told them. A copy should go to the proxy, the treating team, and a trusted family member. And the proxy must be willing, at the worst possible moment, to repeat the patient's decision exactly as it was made. An older woman in the audience changed her authorization from her eldest son to her daughter. My son always tries to choose the safest option for me, she said. My daughter asks what I actually want. As I watched her sign, I remembered that I too had once mistaken professional expertise for trustworthiness. Claire understood surgery better than I did. She understood risk better than I did. She understood hospitals better than I did. But the value of a proxy has never been that the proxy knows more. It is that while everyone else is rushing to provide an answer, that person is still willing to protect the answer that belongs to you. After the session, Grace handed me an old wooden box. It was the last one my grandfather had made in his workshop. Inside were the form appointing Grace as my proxy, the acceptance form for my second transplant offer, and a copy of the old will that was no longer valid. I did not burn them. Forgetting does not erase an injury. It only allows the next person to step into the same gap. I placed the wooden box in the fund's records cabinet beside a row of anonymized case files. Behind every file was someone whose wishes had been replaced while they were unable to speak. All we could do was make the next record clearer, and make the next proxy decision harder to distort with emotion or power. Before leaving the conference room, I wrote a sentence on the whiteboard. Medicine can prolong life. Only choice can protect dignity. The liver that should have been offered to me first would never come back. I would not pretend my second chance erased the first harm, but from that day forward, no one would ever decide for me whose survival I was required to place before my own. This time, I signed for my own life.